Podcasts are hot, and a great way to leverage them is being a guest. But often we get people that come to us and they're not seeing the results that other people are. And their answer, it's always the same. I need to get on better podcasts. Now, maybe they've been doing it themselves. Maybe they've had some booker that's been reaching out. But the answer, why they're not getting results, is always the same. I need to get on better podcasts. When we dig in and say, well, what do you mean by better? How do you define better? Often, well, I would say almost all the time, it's they want to get on bigger podcasts. They want to get on famous podcasts. They want to get on the marquee podcasts. You know, if only I was on Tim Ferriss, then this would happen. If only I was on Joe Rogan's podcast, well, then I could do this. If only I was on Brene Brown's or Harvard Business Review. And here's the ugly truth. And we tell them this. And this is calling your baby ugly. This is not politically correct. This is not good marketing. Well, maybe it is good marketing. It is being honest with people. The problem is not the podcast. It's the guest. It reminds me sometimes of people going fishing. And they'll be in a lake. Maybe it's a small inland lake. And there's other people in there that are just pulling fish out left and right. And they can't seem to catch anything. And clearly, the answer is the lake. If only they were at a bigger lake, then they'd have more success. Well, you know, these are the same people that go out and charter a boat, go out in the ocean, and still can't catch fish. And why? Because it's not the pond you're fishing in. It's how you are fishing. Now, let me unpack that a little bit. First of all, you've got to find the right pond, right? You've got to target. You can't just go on any podcast any more than you can go to any bucket of water and find a fish. Fish, you won't find them in swimming pools. But often we start complaining about the podcast. Well, it's a lousy podcast. It didn't have my ideal audience. When really what we should be looking at is, did I do everything I could to convert there? And let me give you some examples here. Often I'll listen to guests, and they're not following the best practices. I've heard people say, "Well, I don't need a microphone, right? The microphone on my computer is fine." Or I've heard people on big podcasts where all of a sudden the host has to tell them, "Hey, I think your earbud is banging against your shirt." Oh man, you know, use a professional microphone. Other ones are people won't have any process. How are you going to move somebody from being a passive listener to an active visitor to an engaged lead? What's the process? What's the hook that you're going to give them? And honestly, our studies have always shown it's best to give them 3 hooks: a small yes, a medium yes, and a heck yes. It's almost like going fishing and going, well, you know, I'm out here. You know, the fish see me. Why aren't they just jumping in the boat? Well, that's not how it works. Other ones, I'll see that they keep saying, I want to do more podcast, more. That is the answer. And I always push back and say, more is not the answer. Better is the answer. Not only doing better podcasts, but being a better guest on the podcast. Talked with somebody the other day, and their goal was to do 200 podcast interviews in the month of June. How can you do 200 quality podcast interviews, right? Because the interview is going to take an hour. You better do some prep. You better promote every episode. Does your audience really want to see you promoted 200 podcast interviews in 1 month? I don't think so. And how are you going to be fresh? How are you going to be energetic? People know when you're phoning it in, when you're not fully there. So instead of spending 200 hours doing 200 crappy interviews, why don't you spend 10 hours and maybe do 4 great interviews? Why don't you hire somebody to help you? And so that it maybe takes you, 8 hours to do 4 amazing interviews. You see, more is not better. Better is better. Bigger is not better. Bigger is just bigger. So this is my rant here. Often people come to us and say, podcast interviews don't work. They'll blame it on the podcast. They'll blame it on the host. And as I look through our databases and show them the podcasts they've been on, I'm like, maybe you should look and say, is it the system that I'm using or system that I'm not using? You know, you wouldn't spend your time going out fishing if you didn't have the right gear, if you weren't prepared for it. You wouldn't go on stage to an audience of hundreds, much less thousands, if you weren't prepared. So it's the same way with podcasts. Don't set the goal of, I want to be on 200 digital stages this month or 200 physical stages. No, it won't work. Do targeting. Make sure that you're making the most out of every podcast interview. If you want tips, we've got all kinds of tips here that we do for best practices. There's a free copy of my book, Podcast Guest Profits. It's the system we use to turn people from being a passive listener to an active visitor to an engaged lead. I want to make sure that you're getting the most value from every podcast interview and that you're delivering the most value, not just wasting your time or wasting the audience's time. So if you're not getting the results that you see, look at the podcast. Is it the right podcast? But also look in the mirror. Listen to your interview. Have other people listen to it. People that are honest, that know and say, is this following all the best practices? Is it a nice conversation or is it a discussion that's going to move people from being a passive listener to an active visitor and ultimately engaged lead? People come to us and say, can you help me get on a podcast? I said, well, if you want better answers, you need to ask better questions. You don't need anybody's help to get on a podcast. There's 2 million podcasts out there. You could get on 200 next month if you wanted. Problem is they're not the podcast you want to be on. I'll say, if you want to grow your brand and grow your business with a podcast, that's where we can help.